Hello and welcome to Take a Beat, where we sit and chat about the message that we just listened to this past weekend. So I am so glad to be back here. My name is Tears. I'm the digital pastor. Last week I was on the other side and it was an uncomfortable place for me. I am back on this side of the table and I really like it. And also Pastor Dave is back with us. He is speaking this weekend, but also he's back from Israel. How was Israel, PD?
Oh, it was a great trip. I love going to Israel. I don't go, it's not a pilgrimage. I go for two reasons. Number one, I like to see the place where all these things in the Bible happened. And every time I go, I try and see new places. Yeah. But I see some of the same places, it always encourages me. Number two, I always go with people from IES. So you say, oh, Pastor Dave, it must be really good. Well, one of the good things about it is there's 35 people. I was with them 24/7 for 12 days. Yeah. And you really get to know people. You know them when they come dressed for church and they sit and smile. You really know them when it's 3 o'clock in the morning and they're trying to carry their bags down and load their bags in a bus when there's no room and all that kind of stuff. That's when you really get to know them. So.
Well, that sounds like a lot of fun. And you went to Greece as well, right?
We went to Greece, my first time to Greece. We only did Athens and we did Corinth, so it's basically a part of the whole Paul thing. There's a bunch of other stuff there with Paul, but there are not a lot of ruins in the other cities, Thessalonica, Berea, so it was amazing. I mean, it was amazing. 1 Corinthians is like my favorite book in the Bible.
Mine too.
Studied it a whole bunch. It's so powerful with so many things. And then to be there and, this is where this happened. Paul stood on this spot and defended himself, in the Bema Judgment place. I was just like, wow, it's fantastic.
Ah, well, we're glad you're back at IES.
I'm glad I'm
back. With the rest of us. So I was sitting there listening to your sermon and I just started laughing because I was like, wow, this is going to be an interesting discussion material for not just us in this conversation, but also for families when they sit down and talk about this. Because you talk about things like, okay, honoring your parents versus obeying your parents and kind of that. So you're a parent. Mm-hmm. I don't have kids yet. But how did it, and your daughter is an adult and a wonderful, wonderful person. Mm-hmm. So how was the transition from when she was a child and had to obey you and Gigi, and then when she's grown to be an adult and making her own decisions? I'm asking this because there are times when I'm talking to some of the former teens and they're saying, oh, I went away, I'm an adult, I went to college and I came back and my parents still treat me like I was 17, 16, 15 maybe.
I would say, first of all, let me say this. You're the digital pastor. I'm the analog pastor. So everybody needs to know I'm old-fashioned. I don't do well in a Google workspace or anything else like that. Am I allowed to say labels? Anyway, okay. So let me just say how it worked. My wife and I, number one, we always made it very clear that we were together on how this all worked. And so that's how we reinforced the thing that the relationship with a spouse is primary. Yeah. All right. So then when we were parents of Isabel, we agreed together what levels of independence she could have at different things. And we didn't agree on what it should be, but before we engaged her in conversation, we had already come to a point of agreement. And so we set certain things, certain boundaries. At this age, you'll be able to do this. At this age, you'll be able to do that. And we made it very clear. And she was able to discuss us with it. And, she could question why we did things and things like that. But I think the important thing for parents is to understand that first primary relationship that they have with each other lays the foundation for all the other relationships. And if there's not the security of knowing your spouse backs you 100%, then it can get really, really complicated. Yeah. And that doesn't mean that my wife agreed with everything I ever told Isabel. You don't always get a chance to say, hold on, we're going to go in the other room. We're going to talk about this. Stay there, But whatever I said in the moment, she backed it, even if she disagreed. Whatever she said, I backed it. And then we talked it out later. And if there needed to be an adjustment, we could come back and say, we've talked about this. But that's always been the way it worked. And I think in Isabel's case, I think it worked really, really well. Every family has to do a version of that.
Yeah.
But your version may be different, but it's got to be based on this primary premise. We do certain things because we belong to God. God comes first, all right? And then our relationship as husband and wife comes next. And all those other relationships are based on that. And that includes our expectation to her about what we expect her, how we expect her to relate to us as adults. And so I think it works really well.
So how has things changed for the better in your relationship with Isabel as she's like an adult?
It really hasn't changed that much. Okay. I mean, what I would say is when she was a child, there was a discussion about her decisions. She was able to make decisions, but there was a discussion about it. Now there doesn't need to be a discussion about it. She make her own decisions, and that's fine. But we enjoy when she dialogues with us and explains why she made the decisions. And sometimes when she's thinking her way through things, she gets our feedback. But she no longer needs our permission or anything else like that.
I think that's a big thing. Even looking back on my relationship with my parents, it was that discussion versus permission as an adult, rather than asking, "Oh, can I do this? Is it like am I allowed to do this?" And actually having the wonderful relationship, the ability to call your parents and ask. I mentioned this in my sermon last week. Oh, I'm actually having this decision. What do you think? And these are people who know me and know my personality, know what I'm passionate about, and were able to kind of help me process through that.
Oh, well, not only that, they know you, you know them.
Yes.
And nobody is perfect in their opinions and their observations. We all know the blind spots that our parents had, so that when we got their advice, we could kind of sort it out how it was going to work. When we're younger, they tell us what to do. When we're older, they give us advice, and they do it to the best of their ability. Yeah. The really interesting thing about this particular stage of it is, this is a very sensitive topic. It comes down to obedience as you're a child and honoring when you're older. And the sensitivity, I've been amazed how many times in my experience here in Indonesia, a Christian in the church has been told by their non-Christian parents, "Oh, you have to obey me or you're a bad Christian." And we're talking about adults, and it's really ironic for me that the parent would say, "You have to do what the Christians say you have to do. I'm not a Christian, but you have to, And of course, the Bible clearly does not say that offspring obey their parents. It says children. And as I point out, that same idea in verse 1, children obey your parents, we're told that the flip side of that in verse 4 is parents, as you raise your children, don't exasperate them, train them, like that. Yeah. So it's clearly children. There's no other way to interpret it. And yet, some people are under the impression that you always obey your parents. And you can't always. In fact, it's pretty clear that it would only relate to godly things.
And as I was sitting and hearing your sermon, I realized that this passage, and it's not just, okay, let's just focus on the children obey passage or section, but it is a part of a bigger conversation.
That's right.
But the conversation is about submission and not control. I think that's two things that we need to just kind of separate because it's talking about mutual submission as well. We submit one to another. That was the thesis, right?
Right.
While I think a lot of the times in people's interactions with maybe their family members, it's more of a control. Like, I want you to do things the way I want you to do things.
Yeah. One time in the old days, we used to travel by ship because the airplane rides were super expensive and they were, bounced from one place to another. We're talking really old days, 50s and 60s. And so one time we were on a ship that was going to cross the equator. So my dad convinced a bunch of the kids to go on deck and bring binoculars because he was going to show them the equator and the water. And they were all out there. In fact, one kid even took a hair and held it in front of their thing so, it looked, I think I see something, And what we need to realize in the Bible is that the chapters and verses are there like the marks on a map. They're there to tell us where. They're not on the land.
Yeah.
There's no equator floating in the water. And so when we read in verse 521, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, it applies to the whole following discussion, which is household codes. It's a very common kind of a structure. I remember, I'm an American and we have a Pledge of Allegiance. Mm-hmm. And then somebody came along with this idea of making a Pledge of Allegiance to the cross. Mm-hmm. And they kind of imitated the way the Pledge of Allegiance was, but it was a Pledge of Allegiance to the cross and what it meant to be a follower of Jesus. It was actually a good idea because it took something people understood and transferred it to something that we should all owe greater allegiance to. Mm-hmm. And that's what Paul's household codes. Yes, children obey your parents, but the flip side of that is parents, don't treat your children unfairly.
Yeah.
That doesn't exist in any household codes.
No, yeah.
Parents were free to do all kinds of things to their kids, and nobody really cared. And so that's really what jumps out at that.
Yeah, and I think, also seeing this passage as a letter in its entirety, rather because if, for example, we're sending an email to someone, we're not like, okay, marking verse 1, verse 2.
Well, I've gotten some letters that should have been done that way, but anyway.
Just so that you can refer to it. Yeah, so, okay, continuing our conversation, you mentioned just now about spouses having each other's backs. And this might be a little bit more interesting in relationships to in-laws. So how do you make of that? Because there's no exactly how a verse for in-laws in there.
Oh yeah, there clearly is. The Bible, and very, very early in Genesis chapter 2, it says, "For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife." Now people say, yeah, but that only applies to the man, not to the wife. No, that's ignorant. There was no question that a woman became a part of the husband's family. What that is simply saying is that the spouses put each other first. And people say, well, that's a Western idea. No, it's not. I mean, that's as east as you can get, or the Chaldees, wherever the Garden of Eden was, right? And I have seen over and over and over and over where families and marriages have really had a really hard time because the spouses were not able to express to each other, or were not able to come to a place where their primary loyalty was to each other. Now, in some places, the girl marries the guy and moves in with the guy's family, and the guy's mother makes her life miserable. In some places, the girl and the guy move in with the girl's family, and the guy becomes insignificant. It's a different kind of dynamic, at least in the cultures I know where that happens, but the guy becomes insignificant, and so all of those things kind of happen. And what you need to remember is your spouse has a greater priority than your parents. That's all there is to it. If you're in a boat and the boat sinks and your mom is drowning and your spouse is drowning, you save your spouse. That's it. And if the two of you together can save her or him, that's great. But your first priority is your spouse. And a lot of people in Indonesia and other places don't want to hear that. And they need to, and they've never abandoned that role of controlling. Now, honoring is really important.
Yeah.
You would, I guess in the drowning scenario, you would say, Mom, as soon as I rescue my wife, I'm throwing you, I'm carrying that too far. But you honor your parents, you respect your parents, and you do it as a couple.
Yeah.
But your first loyalty goes to your spouse.
So I'm looking at real life experiences. For you as a son, when you married Gigi and Gigi married into the family, how did this kind of play out with your parents?
Well, my relationship with my parents is really good. We had established, the appropriate distance. They didn't try and tell me what to do, so when Gigi married me, when we got married and we started our own family, there wasn't an immediate kind of an issue where, oh yeah, well, we're going to fight over who's doing what or whatever. It was somewhat awkward because my mom and dad were my boss organizationally. And so that can be a little bit complicated because it's like, are you telling me this as my boss or as my mom? You know, something like that. And but it was really clear. I mean, I needed to establish to my parents, no, this is the thing that Gigi and I are talking about or doing, and this is our thing, and you can't tell us what to do.
Yeah.
And you know, with all due respect to mom and dad, it needed to be established. They were good parents, but they weren't perfect. It needed to be established. I think it was a much bigger jump in some ways for my wife, and I think her mother and father made that jump really, really, really well. You know, they very, very quickly brought me into the family and treated me with respect. And I mean, I was their pastor, but yet that was an adjustment to them for my wife to have the independence she gained by marrying me. And so it worked well, but it's not automatic. You know, you need to be intentional about all these things, and it's really important. And I have seen the number one in all the years I've been in Indonesia. I've seen this as the number one problem for new couples, where usually the son doesn't defend his wife from his mom. And I know marriages that are broke up now because it didn't happen. And most of the time the son doesn't think anything about it because he grew up with a mom who's strong and domineering, and he adjusted to it, and usually it wasn't about him anyway. And yeah, it's like my friend Jeff Hartensville says, the son is the only perfect man that the mother has ever known. She knows her husband's not perfect. And so when his loyalty, his primary loyalty, switches to another person, it's painful. And, you know, and so it needs to be stood up for.
So on the flip side, when you married into Gigi's family, how did you intentionally decide to honor your mother-in-law?
It wasn't hard at all. You know, there was all the normal issues and everything else, and maybe more than normal issues. The family liked me, but they didn't want Gigi to marry me. You know, they said, well, you guys can get married in about 10 years, you know, something like that. Yeah, I knew the family pretty well. I got along well with my father-in-law. When Gigi wasn't around, I did stuff with him. We went to basketball games and all this kind of stuff. And that just became actually a really easy relationship. And look, one of the things that people need to understand is I know that I don't know all the dynamics in my wife's family. And I don't try and pretend that I do. I trust her to guide me, and she trusts me to guide me in the family. And you really need to do that. You need to count on your spouse to help you navigate. Every family is complicated. And, you know, I don't have to understand things. And by the way, let me say this for all of you who are listening, never comment about your spouse's family. You know, if your spouse says, oh man, my dad is so unreasonable, don't say, yeah, he is. You just say, you know, oh, I love you, you know, or, you know, something like that. And
How can I support you?
Yeah. I mean, I've been married 33 years, and I don't exercise or expect that I have the freedom to understand what goes on as a dynamic in their family. And the family treats me with love and respect. I'm very happy to be a part of the family. My mother-in-law is the only person of that generation that we still have alive for us. And so, Mama Villa, I love you, and you're my remaining over-generation person. And I love you as my mother-in-law, and in a real sense as my mother. So.
Well, I think that's...
You need to watch this, Mama, so you'll see that.
Yes. And I think this is like all the time we have for today. I feel like this is something that we can talk like a long time about. But thank you, PD, for sharing some of your personal stories about this, and just for fodder for thought. I think it's a good thing for us to think about and even talk about this with our families and how this would work out or look like in our families. So thank you so much for sharing. Thank you for joining us. Please comment with some of your thoughts or follow us in our journey on Facebook, Instagram, our community and come to our services, and we can talk some more about stronger families. So tune in for Take a Beat next week.